Since man first traversed the Columbia River, the long narrows at the Dalles, or as the French voyagers called it, Les Grandes Dalles de la Columbia, has been a formidable barrier to traffic on the river. In this 8.5 mile stretch, from Tumwater Falls to the foot of 5 Mile Rapids, the drop was 81 feet at low water. In some places, the river literally turned on edge, with the total volume of its flow being compressed between basalt cliffs, in some places as little as 125 feet apart. As early as 1876, the United States Army Corps of Engineers started planning methods of diverting steamboat traffic around this stretch of raging water. After exhaustive surveys and consideration of various proposals, a final plan was agreed upon in 1903, calling for a canal 8.5 miles long with a width of 45 feet and a depth of 8 feet, with 4 locks that would be 45 feet wide and 300 feet long. The cost of this project was estimated at $4,125,000, and following the appropriation of funds, work was commenced in October 1905, 31 years after the first study was made. It was completed in 1915, with the opening ceremonies being held May 5, 1915. This aerial view shows the Celilo Canal on the right, with the downriver entrance at Big Eddy at the bottom of the picture, and then stretching upward to its upriver exit just above Celilo Falls. To the left of the picture can be seen the Long Narrows. Inasmuch as this picture was taken during a low water period, the basaltic cliffs that hemmed in the river are very evident. Here we see the tandem locks at Big Eddy under construction. Note that much of the excavation was through solid rock. Pneumatic drills and blasting powder were the standbys in this type of construction. There was also lots of pick and shovel work involved in a construction job of this nature. Early stages of construction upstream from the entrance locks at Big Eddy. Much of this rock was solid enough that in some stretches it was not necessary to line the channel with concrete, and a minimal amount of grouting was sufficient to contain the water level in the canal. 5 Mile locks under construction. This shows the wooden forms and bracing timbers in place prior to concrete being poured. This being prior to plywood being used in construction, the form material used was probably 10 or 12-inch shiplap. A steam shovel loading dump cars with excavated material. Narrow gauge railroad tracks were laid in the area being worked and extended as work progressed. Some idea of the scope of this undertaking can be gained from a list of equipment on hand at the close of 1910. 4 steam shovels, 1 land dredge, 15 locomotives, 83 4-yard dump cars, 1 rock crusher, 1 sand grinding plant, 2 concrete mixing plants, 2 air compressor plants, 30 steam and air drills, 1 electric light plant, and 31 horses. Here are some of the 31 horses moving sand with Fresno scrapers. Construction proceeded under adverse conditions, as pictured in this winter scene. The stiff-legged derricks shown here were used to lower concrete buckets while pouring the walls and floor of the locks. As in any construction project, there were bound to be work-incurred injuries, so a first aid station and infirmary were a necessary part of the operation. The first picture shows the beds in the infirmary, while the following picture shows the instrument cabinet and the pot-bellied stove used to provide heat and boil water for instrument sterilization. No record exists of the number of fatalities during the 10-year construction period, but one newspaper account stated that in 1 year, 8 men were killed. The steam-powered shovels were essential in moving the heavy rock after it was blasted loose from the canal site. The excavation of the canal totaled 1,402,000 yards of rock and 1,606,000 yards of sand. This was before the days of rubber-tired earth movers and Caterpillar tractors, so all material had to be moved by steam shovels, horse-drawn scrapers, and hand labor. This is the 5 Mile lock nearing completion. The form lumber has been removed, and all is in readiness for installation of the steel lock gates. The portage railroad that had existed prior to the canal proved to be very useful in hauling the heavy steel parts for the lock gates and other material used in construction. A close-up view of the steam locomotives used to pull dump cars over the narrow gauge track that was laid wherever needed and then extended as the work progressed. By today's standards, the locomotive looked small, but it was low-geared and powerful and was an indispensable part of the construction process. Here construction is nearing completion at the east end of the canal at Celilo. The tall structure at the left is the Taft fish wheel, one of the early wheels at Celilo, and a very productive one. Mr. Taft, one of the early participants in catching and canning salmon, had 3 fish wheels and a cannery based at Celilo. Another view of the nearly completed canal near Celilo, showing the swing span on the SP&S Railroad Bridge that crossed the Columbia River at this point. The section of the bridge that crossed the canal could be rotated to allow the taller steamboats to pass through the canal. Just prior to the opening of the canal in May 1915, this spectacular dynamite blast was set off to remove an obstruction near the mouth of the canal. It is not known if this obstruction was part of the cofferdam built during construction of the locks or a rock reef that proved a problem for boats entering the canal. Here is a portion of the printed program for the formal opening of the canal on May 5, 1915. J.N. Teal, a prominent Portland lawyer who had long been active in promoting the open river concept, was the master of ceremonies. Colonel J.J. Morrow of the Corps of Engineers presented the canal to the people, and speeches were given by the 3 governors in attendance and a number of senators and congressmen attending the celebration. The steamship Undine was the flagship of the flotilla that carried several hundred dignitaries from Portland to Lewiston, Idaho, and then back down the river, with stops for festivities at Pasco, Wallula, Umatilla, and Maryhill. Ceremonies were held at each stop, with the final and largest celebration at the Big Eddy entrance to the canal. It was estimated that 10,000 people attended the celebration marking completion of the canal. Many arrived by steamboat, and special trains came from eastern Oregon and inland Empire points in Washington and Idaho. Following the ceremonies at Big Eddy, the crowd gathered in the Dalles, where there was a street parade, fireworks, a baseball game, and a banquet at the local Elks Club for 200 of the highest-ranking dignitaries. The steamer J.N. Teal, named for the man who had done so much to make this dream of an open river a reality, is shown in these 2 views taken on the opening day, and the first view showing the vessel traversing the double locks at Big Eddy, and the second in the turning basin a short distance above the canal entrance. The J.N. Teal was a fast and popular boat and was active in hauling passengers and freight from Portland to upriver points. Here we see the completed canal near the upper terminus just above Celilo Falls. With the completion of the canal, it was possible to ship freight from Portland to Lewiston, Idaho, without having to stop at the Dalles and transfer passengers and freight by a portage railroad to an upriver steamboat moored above Tumwater Falls. One of the vexing problems, both during construction and during the subsequent operation of the canal, was the spring freshet that almost every year inundated the canal and made necessary to close it for a number of weeks. This picture was taken during the flood of May 1948, during which period the Columbia reached a height only exceeded by the Great Flood of 1894. Not only did the floodwaters make the canal inoperable, but the silt and rocks that were carried into the canal necessitated several weeks of dredging and cleaning before the canal could be opened to traffic again. A casualty of the 1948 flood was the steamship Georgie Burton that had been presented to the city of the Dalles to be used as a maritime museum. It was temporarily moored at the Big Eddy turning basin, where the force of the floodwaters snapped several of its mooring lines, causing it to wash up on the wall of the canal, breaking its back. It was damaged beyond repair and had to be destroyed. A tug and barge in the canal near Celilo. On the bank above the canal can be seen the Indian village, which swelled to several hundred people during the spring and fall fishing seasons, when Indians from eastern Oregon and Washington would gather at the famous tribal fishing grounds at Celilo Falls. Due to intense and cutthroat competition from the railroads, the steamboat traffic never attained the degree envisioned by the proponents of the canal, and it was not until completion of Bonneville Dam that tug and barges carrying petroleum products upstream and wheat downstream made the canal a busy thoroughfare. The powerful tug Keith approaching the lock below Celilo at the upper end of the canal. With the completion of McNary and other upstream dams, traffic on the river increased immensely, with over 1 million tons of freight passing through the canal during its final years of operation. A tug and barge in the upper end of the canal. At the right of the picture can be seen the Tumwater fish wheel, one of the very productive wheels on this section of the river. The size of tugs and barges was limited by the width and depth of the canal, and river transportation did not reach its fullest potential until the construction of the Dells and John Day dams with their larger locks making the use of larger barges feasible. One of the last vestiges of the canal can be seen from the I-84 freeway a few miles east of the Dells. With the completion of the Dells Dam, the canal finally was closed January 2nd, 1957. It never fulfilled the dreams of those early day enthusiasts who labored so long and diligently to have it built.
Celilo Falls was one of the most important of the ancient fishing grounds for Indians of the Pacific Northwest. Prior to the advent of white men in the area, the native Indian population of the Columbia Basin has been estimated by various sources to have been about 50,000. Salmon contributed the most important part of their food supply, with it being in the realm of probability that Indian per capita average consumption of salmon was 1 pound per day. With an Indian population of about 50,000, the annual salmon catch in the Columbia Basin would have been about 18 million pounds, which is over half the average annual commercial catch on the Columbia in later years. Lewis and Clark encountered Indians catching and drying salmon at many places in the Columbia Basin on their epic journey to the sea, and noted the large number of Indians living and fishing at Celilo Falls and Cascade Rapids, where spears and dip nets were used. In one type of dip net, the net was so arranged that the meshes would slip on the hoop and slide down to close the net opening after a fish was caught. In describing this type of gear he saw used at Willamette Falls in 1842, United States Navy Captain Charles Wilkes said, quote, "The mode of using the net is peculiar. They throw it into the foam as far upstream as they can reach, and it being then quickly carried down, the fish who are running up in a contrary direction are then caught," unquote. In the other type of dip net, the meshes were tightly tied to the hoop around its circumference. The hoop was secured and, most often, placed in an eddy, hugging the bank, with the net bagging out in a direction opposite to the main river current. Fish swimming into the eddy and net were thus caught. A sharp bump on the hoop or quick jerks on the signal string, which was attached to the net itself and held in the fisherman's hand at the opposite end, announced that a salmon was in the net, followed, of course, by the fisherman pulling up the hoop and net as fast as possible. In 1855, the United States government entered into treaties with various Indian tribes in the Pacific Northwest. On June 9th in Walla Walla, Governor Isaac Stevens of the Territory of Washington entered into agreements with tribes and bands now making up the Yakima, Nez Perce, Warm Springs, and Umatilla Indian nations. On June 25th of the same year, Joel Palmer, Superintendent of Indian Affairs in the Oregon Territory, entered into similar agreements with various bands of Walla Wallas and various bands of Wascos at a site near the Dalles known as Treaty Oak. Common to each treaty was the exclusive right of the Indians to take fish in the streams running through or bordering the reservations established. It also preserved their right to take fish at all usual and accustomed places in common with citizens of the United States, as at Celilo Falls. The annual average commercial catch in the Columbia River was 30 million pounds in the 75-year period 1866 to 1940. To put this into further perspective, the annual average salmon catch at Celilo Falls was 1.9 million pounds in the years prior to the destruction of that fishing area by the rising pool above the Dalles Dam in March 1957. The various tribes were paid in compensation a total of $27 million, based on the average catch during the 5-year period 1949 to 1953. At the peak of the fall Chinook run each year, Celilo Falls was one of the greatest attractions in the Pacific Northwest, with thousands of visitors coming on Sundays to watch the dip netters pull salmon out of the water, sometimes fish being caught in each sweep of a net. Until 1957, Indian fishing methods had changed little, with about 95% of the total Indian commercial catch of 2 million pounds annually being taken at Celilo, nearly all with dip nets. Then in 1961, the Indians began to experiment with set gill nets in the pools above the dams, and a new fishery was born, which continues today. The Treaty Indian gill net fishery extends 130 miles from Bonneville Dam to McNairy Dam. The drift gill net commercial fishery, the only non-Indian method legal on the river today, extends from Bonneville downstream to the sea. The dominant force in the salmon fisheries in the Dalles-Celilo area was Seufert Brothers Company, organized in the 1880s by Frank Seufert and his brother Theodore. Besides canning salmon and fruit, the company's fish wheels and seines harvested salmon, and fish were also purchased from independent fishermen as well. Fish wheels were outlawed in Oregon, effective in 1927. In the state of Washington, their use was prohibited beginning in 1935. Fish wheels never caught more than 7% of all the salmon caught commercially in the Columbia River, the annual average being substantially less. Seufert's Tumwater #1 fish wheel was one of the 3 best fish catchers in this part of the Columbia, averaging about 38 tons of salmon per season. This wheel was designed to fish in low water, and thousands of people who visited Celilo each fall to watch the Indians harvest salmon may remember this dipper, a huge towering structure rising from the riverbank. 2 hanging platforms attached to the basalt rim of the cul-de-sac falls at the eastern edge of Chief's Island, directly opposite Chinook Rock, occupied a fine fishing site. None at Celilo was better. When the fish were running heavily, the fishermen here tried to avoid catching too many fish in one sweep, as this would cause the net to tear, thereby losing fish and also forcing the dip net to be replaced with another. Catching 2 salmon at a time was not uncommon. One September day in the 1930s, 17 tons of fall Chinook were caught by fishermen using these 2 platforms, and they were paid 2 cents per pound for their efforts. At other times, the price dropped to 1/2 cent per pound, and there were days when no fish could be sold because of lack of buyers. In those Depression times, people had little money, and often bartering came into play, trading freshly caught salmon for produce from the farms, such as potatoes, hams, eggs, bacon. It was a sad experience for some when the gates at the Dalles Dam were dropped on a Sunday morning in March 1957, and the fishing sites and fast water of the river were inundated by the rising pool behind that project. Near sunset that day, the Indians, with their long braids and black, wide-brimmed hats, solemnly watched their ancient fishing grounds at Celilo Falls slowly disappear under the water. A great and historic site on the Columbia had vanished.